My name is John Maden, and I work as a customer success manager here at Acquia. Thank you for joining today's webinar regarding some of the challenges faced by organisations in the not-for-profit sector. And some of the lessons to be learned, I guess, are applicable to any organisation that deals with customers, really. So many of you will have been in situations where your team has a brilliant idea for a campaign, the mission is urgent, the passion is high, but then you hit a wall. Maybe it's your CRM that won't talk to your email platform, or your internal approval process is too difficult to navigate, or your data is so siloed that you can't see the person behind the donation. So we're very pleased to have Manifesto with us today. Manifesto are a leading digital experience agency who work with many of our customers, and they will present their findings and recommendations from their recent research, where they access 300 charities and 2,000 supporters. So quite a wide audience to get feedback and views from. And as a result of all those interviews and research, they produced a report called Mind the Engagement Gap. So I guess that might not be familiar to US people, but in the UK, if you ever go on the London Underground, you're always told to mind the gap. Manifesto's report identifies 5 major areas that can contribute to the engagement gap. What we mean by the engagement gap is where there's a difference between what supporters need and expect and the experiences that are delivered. So the areas that can contribute to this gap can come from decision making, people and mindset, technology and data, teams and skills, and audience experience. So for instance, if you look at technology and tools, if they're not integrated and you've got fragmented data sets, that won't lead to a very good customer experience. So Manifesto are going to examine these areas in more detail and in their upcoming presentation. Finally, we'll also look at how organisations are navigating operational realities today. So we're very pleased to welcome Meredith Sneddon from Trussell. They're a UK charity who provide emergency food and practical support to people in their hardest moments. And Meredith previously worked in Trussell's digital marketing team, and she's now head of systems. So she can provide a first-hand perspective on the challenge of aligning teams, processes, and MarTech to drive better customer outcomes. So let's dive in. To kick things off, I'd like to introduce Lou Barton and Stephi Harding from Manifesto and hand them the microphone.
Fantastic. And thank you so much, John. Really appreciate the wonderful introduction. Just going to do that awkward Zoom thing. Can everyone see my screen and hear me? Wonderful. So thank you again, John, for introducing us. Really lovely to meet you all. I'm Lou. I am Principal Consultant for Customer Experience and Engagement at Manifesto. I'm really excited to kind of share some insights that we have uncovered and shared across the sector around minding the engagement gap. And John, really glad that you got the TfL reference through that. So thanks for shouting that one out. But it's really about understanding how we can work together to understand like what are the common factors, the common challenges that exist within our sector that contribute to kind of being able to reach audiences and deliver experiences that meet their needs. So as I mentioned, I'm Lou Barton, but I will pass to Steffi to just introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephi. I am a Senior Engagement Strategist at Manifesto.
Fantastic. And Meredith.
Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm Meredith. I'm the Head of Systems and Architecture Development here at Trussell. But as John said, just a few months ago, I was Head of Digital Marketing and have also spent some time as a Head of Individual Giving in my time at Trussell. So I have kind of seen these problems from all sorts of different angles.
Got many different hats that you're bringing to life through a few examples. So thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us and to discuss what engagement looks like at Trussell. So a good place to start, and quote that I love. Einstein knew a thing or two about solving problems, so we can take inspiration from here. So if I had an hour to solve a problem, I spent the first 55 minutes thinking about the problem and then about 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. And this is the inspiration that we take forward in all of our work really at Manifesto. So we had a shared problem that we discussed and kind of was the inspiration behind the research that we were kind of conducting at the back end of last year. So it was inspired by some research that came out from CAF Giving. So in 2025, it released what the proportion of UK supporters that had donated some form of financial support in the last 12 months. And what that showed was there had been a 4 million fewer supporters in the UK supporting in 2025 to 2019. A huge drop really in the volume of supporters that are kind of continuing to kind of support in terms of that volume. Value is actually holding. However, value is very much seen and propped up by legacy giving and high value. So really the kind of thinking around like what's changed really in this time period to kind of look at this shared problem that we're facing in the sector of like what the fact that audiences are seeking have changed. And this is a growing gap between what audiences are wanting and what organisations are delivering. And even in this period, we aren't necessarily at this stage of even seeing the effect that is upcoming on the application of AI that is only going to kind of blast this gap wide open. So really what we're wanting to do as a sector to kind of step back and be like, what are audiences kind of seeking and how can we best make sure that we're set up to deliver them? So as John mentioned, we conducted a huge scale research on the back end of last year. So we heard from 300 charities about what are the common challenges, where are the bright spots, like what's going well, and where are the kind of the focus for the future, and to be able to kind of support audience experiences. But we also didn't want it to just be a kind of an echo chamber of organisations kind of sharing. We wanted to kind of really draw comparing and contrasting. So we spoke to over 2,000 supporters to really understand like how their experience was in the last 12 months of supporting. Where was it good? Where was it bad? Where do we what were they kind of seeking from that experience? And that really drove forward some key recommendations of what we're trying to do. So whilst the paper is, I think, about like 70 pages long, it will be a good read, but it's really wanting to kind of summarize some of the key findings that we've got here today. So we're here to discuss like what are the internal factors, like what things can we do as organizations that really kind of set us up more effectively to be able to deliver experiences and be able to kind of reduce the gap between what audiences are and their organisations. And what we found was 5 common factors, as John mentioned right at the beginning, and these factors reinforce each other. So they don't kind of operate in silos, they are interconnected, and this is really the lens that we wanted to look at. And what we had seen traditionally is that there is a kind of a form of support that's really around symptom management. So if you've identified there's a thing that you need to do, for example, the CRM causing you a headache and it's restrictive, move to a new CRM. Attrition is high, we're losing more supporters than we're gaining, plug more money at the acquisition side. Open rates on emails are falling and the change in subject lines may help that. But I don't know about others, but in our experience, it's really been that symptom prescription response usually makes a difference and makes some change in the short term. But as time goes on, there are factors that mean that its kind of potential impact has reduced. And this traditional method of A plus B equals C is really starting to kind of be questioned by the kind of the insight that we found. So the way in which that manifesto look at this is looking at the interconnected relationship between these factors that we found, with the curiosity to kind of understand like what is causing what is the kind of the pressure that is happening on one factor or another, to kind of really then find like where are we arriving at a root cause. And this is the lens that we are looking through. So it's a school of thought called systems thinking. And systems thinking approach looks at those invisible patterns and relationships between the interdependence between the factors. So it gives us a new view of actually why they exist, how they reinforce each other, and actually kind of identify that root cause. So, starting at the most visible symptom that we have found as part of our research, and this was on both sides, so understanding where the gap exists from a supporter perspective and where we're perhaps not meeting it, but also internally at organisations, when we asked what is the number one biggest challenge that exists when it comes to supporter experiences. 25% of charities said it's retaining and deepening those relationships. And another 25% said it was about the capabilities that they have in-house to actually design those experiences in the first place. So the gap that we found was that audience experiences are uncoordinated and fragmented across products and channels. So Meredith, coming to you, I'd really love to invite you to kind of share your thoughts on an experience on how this shows up for Trussell.
Yeah, this has definitely shown up for us, particularly when we think about like audience journeys in the digital space. I mean, that in and of itself was a problem because our offline and online experiences weren't joined up at all, and you would receive kind of like really radical different experiences with us as a charity, essentially depending on what you converted on. So did you enter as in like a fundraiser? Did you like sign up to give a regular gift? Did you like take a campaigning action that we were running? And that would really determine the entirety of your experience for the rest of your time as a supporter with Trussell. And there was no real integration between any of that. For us, a lot of this kind of manifested in people were just getting way too many call to actions. We weren't thinking, we weren't cross-selling, we weren't providing opportunities to like test any messaging. And I think as well, for us, what we identified was that this was really rooted in a bit of a culture for us in terms of ownership and where that exists within an organization. So there was a lot of language being used around, well, I own that journey, or I own that audience, or I own that product, which meant that understandably people want to be accountable for the stuff that they own, but how that was manifesting in it was like very different fragmented journeys. And we're going to like come on and talk about some of that mindset stuff later. But one of the things that we identified early on was that not only did we really need to review a lot of our experiences, but we couldn't review them within teams. We had to do it across the entirety of anyone who would be talking to an audience, and started to think like really broadly about who that would be. So not just fundraising and campaigning teams, but social media teams, website teams, like anyone who had a touch point with our audiences needed to come together and needed to kind of like review these holistically. Because of the way that systems were set up, there was a very sort of binary handoff with once you'd converted on the website manager never thought about what content you got ever again. So actually people kind of collaborating and co-owning a lot of this journeys work that we've been doing has kind of helped to break down some of those silos that existed. But yeah, definitely we haven't totally fixed the problem, but we're on the way.
Fantastic. And I think based on the volume of briefs and the conversations that we have with different organizations and the work that we do really around that kind of like uniting and being able to have that unified view of a supporter and then the experiences that they're having, like our supporters do not see us as departments at all. We don't have a digital, they don't go, oh, that's the digital team, so therefore all good. This direct mail is completely different, so I understand why it's different. We know that supporters see this as it's the sum of all interactions that they have with an organisation, so we need to treat it in that sense. So putting our systems thinking hat on when we were analysing really the kind of the what is the relationship between the biggest challenge and what are we hearing across the sector? So we asked the question, why does this show up? And this leads into, I'm really loving the jazzy, the transition slides. So you can compliment me on that later. But this leads us into the reason really that's behind it. And it's something that we get continuously kind of tasked on and spoken about, and really the focus of a lot of our work is really being able to understand like how can tech and data show up. And ultimately, the reason why a lot of experiences are fragmented and uncoordinated is because the systems that they are coming out of are fragmented and uncoordinated, and potentially sprawling. So the tool fuel has hit us all in the fact that there are so many different MarTech tools that are out there, and perhaps different teams procuring different tools for different needs, spinning up new websites, spinning up new CRMs, those types of things, without that kind of centralized view of like, where does all of these systems connect within the organization? So we see that sprawling, disconnected technology stack that often mirrors those organizational silos that exist. And when we ask kind of organizations, what are their biggest pain points, we heard 23% said that their systems are incompatible. And that is one of the biggest reasons for why those end experiences are then fragmented, but also the data is incomplete, and in some beyond this kind of shared, that is untrustworthy in the fact that it's inconsistently collected. Potentially there's issues around data cleanliness. So when you've got different websites, different CRMs, different email systems, and kind of that no connectivity to show that unified view of the supporter, what comes out is kind of what you put in. And we've worked with many organisations like Save the Children, really to kind of look at how to unify these systems, like how to bring that so that we can meet the needs of the supporters and actually have the tech and data to kind of make those experiences come together. So again, Meredith, coming to you, would love to hear about how this shows up at Trussell.
Yeah, this was definitely true. I remember one of my first jobs when I arrived at Trussell was to just map our systems, and you would not believe it looked like a 2-year-old had thrown spaghetti at a wall. It was just absolutely horrifying by the time we sort of reached the end of it. But luckily, thanks to a big digital transformation project we ran with Manifesto and the guys at Acquia, like our systems are in a much better place, and there's like much better integration. Like we don't have a lot of those challenges, but one of the things that has been surfacing, particularly for us in the last sort of 18 months, has now been the data. Like the systems are in a good place, but actually the data model that's sitting on those systems still wasn't quite fit for purpose, and particularly around things when it came to audiences, around how we segmented. So the data model around like what life cycle you were in and therefore what that experience meant for you. And a lot of that had been inherited because when we had historically design change, we had designed things technology first rather than user first. So we just inherited a lot of problems. And so one of the solutions that we identified to that was, again, going back to this like cross-org working, like it can't just be the fundraising team designing something in isolation, coming together across anyone who had any comms or touch points with any of our audiences and designing a new data model for segmentation. So like, what does it mean to be in your nursery stage with us? What does it mean to be an active giver? And that didn't just mean like active for a particular product, like the data model had to sit across all product and systems. So regardless of where you were and what system you were on, we could really easily identify you and provide you with a much better experience as a result of that. We are probably 6 months post rolling that out, and it has made a really significant difference for us in terms of like engagement rates, retention rates, and stuff like that. So kind of going back to that systems thinking that we're talking about here, that like cross-organizational look at audience experiences is like really key for us in terms of resolving some of our problems.
Amazing. And yeah, great to see that cause and effect of really kind of embracing that as the system and seeing what that actually means for when things start to shift on those key metrics that really look at that audience engagement. So again, systems hat. Why? Why does this exist? And I'll pass over to Steffi to walk us through the next gap.
Thank you both. So decision making is the next gap that we found across our research. And when we asked organisations, we had from 19% that a lot of decision making was based on instinct rather than using data. Now, when we work with different organisations, we can see how this can become possible when data is stuck in specific systems or with certain teams that kind of have access to that data, and that becomes possible. But then you have multiple teams making decisions at their local level about their audiences, tech, and data. and focusing there on what benefits their teams rather than taking those kind of collective views that Meredith has been speaking about. And this just continues to cause a misalignment of experiences with different organisations and leading to that sprawling tech stack that Lou mentioned before. So we also saw that 38% of charities reported that they often make decisions based on proven models as well. So looking around the sector, what are other people doing? Will that work for us? Let's just go with that, rather than deeply considering like their audience, which, you know, Lou touched on in the beginning, can sometimes work, can sometimes have an uplift when we kind of do these incremental things, but it isn't getting to the heart of those issues. So Meredith, again, it'd be really great to hear from you on decision making.
Yeah, and I think when people aren't making, in my experience, when people aren't making decisions rooted in data, it's because they don't trust the data, and often they have quite a good reason not to trust that data. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our challenges have been like, we had a really not fit for purpose data model, the architecture within our CRM system, it was really hard to understand and see what was going on. So I understood, like, I knew why people weren't rooting decisions in data, and they had a valid reason not to. So I think for that led to a lot of kind of like lack of critical thinking and decision making. But the other thing we realized for us was that how we approached planning and thinking about audience experiences was kind of the wrong way around. Like, it was very bottom up. So kind of each team was thinking about what they wanted to deliver for those audience experiences. And as a result, as we got closer and closer to delivery, conflicts would arise because multiple teams would want to talk to similar people, or there would be too much volume going out. And what that meant is we were then forcing ourselves into decision making that was based on organizational priority rather than prioritizing what the audience experience was going to be in the longer term. So because of that kind of bottom up approach to planning, that it was like forcing us to make decisions that weren't rooted in data and weren't centered around what was going to deliver the best audience experience. And so a couple of things that have really helped us with that was like, one was that new data model I talked about. So like, how do we segment? What are the data points that we're looking at, and kind of like collectively owning that? But also one of the things was closing the gap on some of that data. So like, what is your attribution model? Like how many organizations can articulate what their attribution model is to understand what audiences are doing, what the life cycle looks like to them. And then as we have increasingly kind of closed some of those gaps that we had in the data, it has then meant that people have much higher trust in the data. So we're moving towards like much better decision making and more like rooted in the data. So that's definitely been one of the things that's like really helped us, is identifying those gaps and really intentionally closing them.
Yeah, I love that, because we can't always as well wait for like data utopia and hoping it gets to this like really magical point. So yeah, that like systematic way of looking at it makes a lot of sense through that as well. I'm sure you know what's coming next. We continue to ask why to get into these systems and wondering what was happening, which leads us to our next point, which Meredith started to touch on a little bit there, which is great, and that is teams and skills. So when teams are built and work around specialization, like products, for example, instead of focusing on collaboration and shared objectives, we find that decision making starts to become very local. So oftentimes teams are operating with a focus on specific deliverables or their budgets, differing KPIs, meaning that they can lose sight of shared goals. And ultimately, this means that there are missed opportunities for audiences and opportunities for silos, which 20% of the organizations we spoke to said are a big problem to start to creep in as well. And we found that 46% of respondents actually struggle to collaborate consistently. So instead of working together, we find these more like production line mentalities where there are a lot of handoffs and trade-offs between teams and a piece of work being done and then moving on to the next, rather than thinking about how we can kind of collaborate from the start. And ultimately, this means that we're losing some context, relevancy, and momentum at every stage of that production line as we go along. So Meredith, keen to hear about teams and skills at Trussell.
Yeah, and it's the KPIs was a big thing for us. So like if you spoke to different teams, even within for example, our individual giving team, there would be completely different KPIs that they were tracking, and none of which were aligned to any kind of like more strategic outcome that we were moving towards as an organization. So for example, like one team would be wanting to prioritize like regular giving, average gifts, another would be focused on second cash gifts, another would be focused on lifetime value. But then once you look at the outcome, it's like, well, which one of these is the priority? And so as a result, that wasn't helping us think about what the audience experiences were, but also wasn't helping us align our KPIs with our what our outcomes are. And I remember sitting in a like income review meeting, and we were looking at like over 30 different KPIs to measure the health of the fundraising program. And I was just like, this is not helpful. Like, this is not building us a clear picture. It's not going to be helping our audiences get the best experience or add value for them when we're trying to measure so many different things, and none of it necessarily seems to be related. And I think part of this for us was how we had structured ourselves around, you either owned an audience or you owned a product. So we had developed this culture of, but I own this audience, but I own this product. So there wasn't that integrated thinking. And as a result, that was really manifesting for audiences in terms of how they experienced us. There was another cultural thing for us that was, we kind of identified that teams saw collaboration as adding bureaucracy to their work, and having to go and consult with multiple different teams who also were talking to audiences was seen as bureaucracy, rather than like, that's the job, right? To deliver the best audience experience to achieve those outcomes. And part of that is having really great conversations with other teams. So we took a very intentional, like, kind of across a bunch of different teams to have like really great coaching conversations to try and sift some of those mindsets. Like, yes, you are responsible for this, but also part of your responsibility is that collaboration is driving that, and just shifting that mindset that collaboration and managing internal stakeholders is the job. It's not unnecessary bureaucracy. And I think that was kind of like how it was perceived, and had some really great conversations with teams to kind of like surface where this was coming from and what was driving that. And some of it was around how we'd structured responsibilities. So started to think about that. But also really starting to think about like, what actually are our priority KPIs? So if we have this like fun, like income line that we're trying to deliver, what's the next layer down in terms of priority? And just being really clear, because it made it really difficult, because it felt like the sand was always shifting, and like, oh, but we got really great like second cash gift this month, but RG average, and it was just meant that we were able to have much more strategic and data-led conversations. So yeah, this one definitely resonated with me when it came out in the report.
Well, it's hard as well when you're like a complex organization delivering services and many different things, where you're going to have so many different objectives by teams and organization. And it is finding those threads and way of kind of looking at things, which can be so important. We've worked recently with the RNIB. We've been helping them with some prioritization tools so they can think about what to kind of prioritize and put first, and factor in all of those different elements that kind of make their work so impactful. So yeah, definitely can hear that one. Great. So we had one final why when we were looking at this, and that pushes us to what we identified as our root cause, and that is people and mindset. So the way that we see that this really shows up is a misunderstanding and a misalignment of audiences, which means that there is this kind of failure to put audiences first. So 24% of organizations told us that there is a culture of resistance to audiences in their organization, and 23% told us that there are conflicting priorities for their audiences, and this causes misalignment and all of the gaps that we've then been speaking about today. And actually addressing this really does require like a mindset shift to move away from this kind of owning, as Meredith said, and instead really trying to deeply understand our audiences and how can we bring them value, and then as a result of that drive the outcomes that we are looking to drive because we have brought them that value. So Meredith, your thoughts on people and mindset and how that's showing up at Trussell?
This was definitely, it's probably been picked up, and like all of the things that I've been talking about has all been rooted in that mindset and how we conceptualize like ownership and responsibility, and like, I own this product, I own this audience, and that's great. And we want it, like, we want people to be able to be super accountable for the work they're doing, like feel a real sense of ownership over it. But actually that had manifested actually in some of our structural choices in terms of how we'd organized ourselves. And so, that was driving a lot. We identified that that was really driving like the problems in the data model were because someone was that audience owner, and so they were making decisions around how that data was structured, and they were the product owner, so they were making decisions around how that journey was structured, and like starting to break down those barriers and start to understand like what is actually the reason that people are doing this. It's very rarely that the tech or the data is a problem. There's like underlying stuff within that. And I think once we kind of reach that stage, we're able to like have really great conversations with teams. And we've actually kind of moved to more of a programmatic structure as an organization around some of this stuff. So where we are structured within programs around outcomes, which means there's a real sense of like collective ownership to do with an outcome, and moved away from a audience ownership sort of model, and actually seeing that the audience strategy sits kind of as the foundation for all of these programmatic outcomes that need to be achieved. And just in terms of how we articulate that and visualize that has really helped start to kind of shift some of the mindsets. The other thing we've done is really refresh our audience strategy and see that as like really foundational. And from the off, before we even rolled that out, like I've seen so many audience strategies fail to deliver great audience experiences because they're not embedded in the data, they're not embedded in the systems, but actually like we did all of that before we sort of launched it internally to teams. So there wasn't this lag, and that's been really great for us in terms of just giving people the visibility of what audiences are doing, and actually that audience strategy then becomes like a real thing that is accounted for in all of these conversations. So we're now having much more audience focused conversations when we're thinking about what we need to deliver, and seeing it much more as like value exchange with audiences rather than just like KPIs, which I think has been really crucial for us and definitely helped like as a result helped improve the KPIs, but by not talking about the KPIs, which feels like a really weird way of doing it, but just seeing it more as a value exchange with audiences has been, really helped us shift the dial.
I love that, like embedding it in the systems first, because it becomes so theoretical when you're talking about audiences and there isn't a way for people to know like how to tangibly use that information as well. So yeah, thank you for that, Meredith. Pass back to Lou.
Amazing. And it's so wonderful to see how it's all showing up as real examples for where it's been a challenge and where you've had some interventions that have kind of all started to those interventions are coming together to make it as great as some of its parts in the change. So introducing it as a system, like when we see this all put together, we can start looking at how we're arrived as a sector in some cases as a lock-in. So firstly, that kind of central issue around the people mindset and the aspect of culture, that has the biggest effect, either positively or negatively on audience experiences, creates that tension that then forms the teams that might kind of then go off in different product or channel or audience directions, that then drives that kind of like siloed, localized decision making that then shapes the technology and data landscape now and in the future, that then impacts and delivers those experiences. And a lock-in is a complicated place to be, because that means that all these factors then go in a reinforcing loop. So that is some contributing factors to why progress is hard. And it's an acknowledgement that we are working in a system that does have kind of like powerful forces to it. But there is good news that, when you can treat things with the complexity and the nuances that it exists within, it can be unraveled with those targeted interventions and coupled with like openness to change. I think, Meredith, what you're sharing in your examples, it's about that. Yes, okay, we know that this isn't showing up for us. Like we need to kind of shift the adaptations in these types of ways. So kind of reframing it into like where we want it to kind of get to is like at the heart of it, our audiences are at the heart of what you do, and they define our people and our mindsets and our culture. We've got our teams that work together across the end-to-end experience and are empowered to collaborate. Decisions are made grounded in the visibility of data and insight. Tech and data is connected, and systems are unified by data across the organization. And then audience insights are consistently used to improve the experience. So the truths that we firmly believe in is being supporter-centric, designing and delivering supporter experiences that meet the audience's needs means only good stuff. So increasing the value, supporters stay longer with you. It frees up your internal team's time when collaboration is used as an asset, and using tech and data more efficiently to be more effectively. So the manifesto method, we've got a number of different solutions that are really all centered around intentionality. And our ethos and our provocation is you can't just take one experience and journey and expect everything to kind of fall in place. You need to kind of transform experiences as a whole. So the solutions that stick long term, like are we coming back in 5 years' time and things are reversing or moving forward? This is what we need to kind of treat it as redesigning experiences that reshapes and appreciates the systems that's created them. one step at a time. And Meredith, everything that you shared, like it's a lot of interventions. Like it's been over a number of years that obviously we've been even working together. But we're starting to really see that like major shift and how that's kind of coming together for your audiences. So we are just kind of at the time that we're going to invite people to come out to groups. I will stop sharing, and actually before that, we wanted to kind of launch a poll and see how these experiences are kind of showing up, how the gap and factors are showing up for audiences.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. Yeah, I'll launch the poll now. I think we're down, a couple of people have had to drop off, so we might just do a group discussion if everyone's comfortable with that. So I know sometimes with timings and things like that. So yeah, I'll launch the poll and then we can then go on to the group discussion because I know you've got a couple of topics ready as well, just to get started. I'll just...
Fantastic. So yes, we can see people mindset is the kind of the biggest barrier to those supporter experience goals. Team and skills, and then follow tech and data, and then the audience experience. So we'd really love to invite for a kind of open conversation around the provocation that we had was reflecting on the gap that you voted for. How could it be shifted even slightly to create the biggest like ripple effect in your organization, and why? So wanted to open up to the floor. Any thoughts on what we'd shared, or any questions around that breakout group question?
I guess I had a question, which I guess links to a reflection on the people and mindset point, and also team and skills, actually, is how much the kind of official structure of the organization reinforces some of that, and how much room to play there is working within the structures of the organization where we might not necessarily have the control or influence to be able to change those.
A really, really good provocation. And Meredith, anyone wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of speak to my experience of that, of like being in a very similar position where I wasn't a director, I wasn't the one who was going to set the organizational structure for the organization, but I was seeing the manifestations of the problems within. And I think some of that has been around like the thing that I spoke about with like where teams saw some of this stuff as bureaucracy and starting to kind of like have really honest conversations with teams and set the expectations that like, I know it feels like this, but this is actually the job, right? Like the job is some of that collaboration to deliver those really good experiences. And I think there is still quite a lot that you can do kind of like just cross team without having to like make really significant cultural shifts, because it is about, I think like you can design the most perfect structure, which I also don't believe exists. There's no such thing, but you can design that. But unless people are thinking about it with the right mindset, it's never going to shift the dial anyway. So it doesn't matter. So I think it has to be both of these things in tandem. And I think problems are symptoms of structure, but they're also the main symptom is like how someone's thinking within that structure, right? So I think there is still, and we haven't solved all of those problems. We still have some product owners, we still have some audience owners, but it's been about like working with teams and me working with other groups to be like, right, we have like this is the problem, we have to deliver better audience experiences, and like it's our responsibility to come together regardless of what the structure looks like to deliver that. So I think sometimes structures reinforce, but I think they can also be challenged, because ultimately if people's mindset shifts, it can help in that space. That's certainly been my experience. I know it's like different organizations have different cultures around these things, but yeah.
And I think just adding to that, like we as soon as we put team and skills gap, it in people's minds it equals structure, which is really interesting, because ultimately, and agree with you, Meredith, like there are better structures than others, but there is no perfect structure. And ultimately it's just ways of organizing people. But it's the most visible, because we've seen an org structure and there's lines and there's boxes and it's wonderful, but it doesn't actually visibly show like what happens day to day, and it's the ways of working that is the biggest difference for how it will be across the audience end-to-end experience. And the biggest gains that can be made really is focusing in on like how are we working together and at what point. I think the collaboration element is really interesting because we've been in a few organizations where we're putting in those collaboration points, and it's met with this collaboration just takes a lot of time, and that's a luxury we do not have, which I think is fair, and it's a reflection of when collaboration hasn't been used in its most effective position. And the way that we kind of look at it is really defining whether you're looking for consent, like you're inviting people to review, reflect, but are we looking for consent, collective consent to move on? Or is it consensus? Because consensus means that you get stuck within this like treadmill conversation of like, we will never approve. So being able to use collaboration like really effectively, so it actually speeds things up. Particularly in the work that Steffi mentioned on RNIB, it was using collaboration earlier when it was kind of work was getting delivered downstream. That was when you then did multiple different briefs for different teams, and it actually was a kind of a false economy of yes, we didn't have the luxury of time earlier, but actually like it's caused so much more time and required to kind of brief these individual teams. So we put more collaboration moments up front to define the solution before it even got to that kind of brief stage. So it's those things of like being really tactical about where collaboration sits within that team and skills, and starting small, piloting different interventions and seeing how it's landing, and then being able to kind of if there are bright spots of it working really well, like evangelizing it across the organization in those cultural moments that really kind of show up. But great, and thanks for putting us the break in the silence, so I really appreciate it. Any other thoughts, I guess, from any other
I've had another question Rebecca's put in the chat, so I don't know. Oh, Sarah, you've got your hand raised. Do you want to just carry on with that last question before we move on to the next one? Or
no, I was going to ask a different question, if that's all right.
no worries.
Um,
Sure. Yeah, you carry on.
Thank you. So it's just a couple of practical things. I think probably this is for Meredith again, if that's right. I'm kind of interested to understand how long the process took up to the point that you are now, and like how the process that you had to go through to kind of convince the necessary people, I guess, and then sort of the work done. And then a lot of it resonated. So sort of thank you for sort of talking through your process. You said you had 30 KPIs, and I guess I'm interested, how many KPIs have you managed to reduce that to?
So I'm no longer in the fundraising team that I was heading up at the time, but I think we got it to like one outcome, four priority ones, and then there were like each KPI, if we wanted to track it, had to directly link to one of those ones. Like that was the only way where I would like they were allowed to have reports on stuff, because it was just becoming ridiculous. So I think maybe let's say like four priority ones, and then there are a couple beneath that were just like supporting, so like different ways of measuring a similar thing. But in terms of how long the process took, for me arriving at Trussell and then being like, can you fix this stuff? We're not done yet, and I've been here 4.5 years, so it is a journey. I think it took me, we were a very digitally immature organisation. For those of you who don't know, Trussell we're a food bank charity, as John mentioned, but we went through a period of enormous growth during COVID, from being an organisation that did like less than 5 million to being a £50 million charity within about 6 months because of the pandemic and everything that happened. So in terms of, as you can imagine, a very small charity, level of digital maturity is very different to the organisation that we became. So there was a lot of appetite for change, but not a lot of understanding of what digital transformation looked like. So I think it probably took me about a year to have the right conversations and help people understand the impact that this was going to have. So it took a really long time. But what I would say is I intentionally took a long time because then it gave us a lot of freedom at the other end. I think people jump into digital transformation without checking that everyone's happy with the direction that we're heading. So, and I think having partners, like I can't speak highly enough of Manifesto and how they helped me navigate some of those conversations once they came on board as our partners. So that took a while. we kind of batched it up knowing that we wanted to address the systems stuff first, largely from a kind of security and compliance perspective. We were like in a lot of trouble, but also we knew we could have the biggest impact there because we essentially did a ground up rebuild of all of our public facing digital platforms. So website, donation gateway, that's all built on Acquia now. But we knew that we could have the biggest impact there. So we sort of prioritized that. And that took, I think we went from discovery to launch in about a year. So it was pretty quick because we also run about 400 plus food banks. So it was pretty significant website ecosystem that we had to redo. It's then probably taken us another 18 months to get to kind of like further downstream to start thinking about data and mindset and culture. So multiple years, but because of the way we sort of batched it up into different projects, it really helped. I feel like there was a lot of momentum, even though at times I still feel like we're never going to get there. But that's helped a lot for us. I saw Rebecca had a question in the chat, which I'm happy to briefly speak to. I don't know if the Manifesto guys want to come in on anything.
You go ahead and then I can.
Sorry, I will try and stop doing all the talking.
You're all good.
Yeah, Rebecca, I absolutely hear that. I'm a big believer in that like tech can help, but tech isn't always necessarily the absolute solution. So I think particularly where budgets are really challenging. So I think aligning platforms without very like a lot of costs, there are often ways of doing this. And I think ultimately it comes down to process, because I think technology is just going to be a manifestation of that process. If those internal teams aren't talking to each other, you have the best technology in the world and it's not necessarily going to solve that problem. So there are, in terms of integrations and stuff like that, like super happy to pick up a side conversation around what your challenges are, because each CRM platform like Salesforce is always going to try and sell you Marketing Cloud and stuff like that. And that's great. And we use that and it's the right solution, but we have to find a thing that works with budget. So it is really difficult. But what I would say is we currently operate in an ecosystem we're not a single house, like we operate on multiple different platforms, multiple different providers, and we found a way to make it work. Because replatforming isn't necessarily always the right solution either. And often what my experience has been is like, it's really rooted in people and process, because the technology is not going to solve that problem. You have to fix that one first. But yeah, super happy to have a side conversation about some of the stuff that we've experienced. Sorry, Manifesto guys.
No, yeah, what to add to that, because I think there's a lot that we completely resonate with. I think we worked with an organization that couldn't connect their CRM to their email platform, but they knew from an audience need they needed to segment their audiences, because the group that they had was too varied. It was people that had the condition, it was a health charity, condition themselves, versus people that were supporting people with, and they needed to be having completely different services. And it's this mindset of finding the way around it. Like there's always a way around to doing it. And in the end, we built a kind of a form in the email platform, even though it couldn't have been integrated, but it just meant that we had that like just crucial question: are you supporting someone with, or do you have it the condition yourself? We captured that, and then we built them to email lists, and that was all done without like jazzy APIs. So it's possible, and it is always possible. But I thought that that from that experience, it proved the value of pushing forward and being like, when we can do that. So for example, in that instance, it had about an 84% increase into the engagement rate when we segmented that audience in that way and then designed the content that meet their needs. So that then became like the cause for the business case to be able to kind of get that investment and be able to connect those systems in the future. So starting small, being like really headstrong on the fact that like it's good to kind of pursue that need, and there are a lot of solutions. Like the mindset that we kind of go into is, how can we adapt the technology that exists currently rather than always replace, because it's often the replacement is not actually as needed. It's just using it in a slightly different way and integrating it with current processes, as Meredith said.